Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar hosted by the National Association of School Nurses. My name is Karen Graff, Nursing Education and Practice Specialist here at the National Association of School Nurses. In the next few minutes, we'll be diving into our panel discussion on proactive care, school nurses' crucial role in gun violence prevention. But before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items and required slides that I will share with you. First, today's webinar is being recorded for future viewing on the NASN Learning Center. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation. At the conclusion of the presentation, we have allotted 10 to 15 minutes for a Q&A session. We encourage you to utilize the chat box to submit your questions, and we will address as many as time permits. The National Association of School Nurses is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nursing Credentialing Centers Commission on Accreditation. The moderator and 3 panelists participating in this webinar, as detailed on this slide, have no financial relationships to disclose. To be eligible for contact hours, participants must be present, successfully complete the post-test, and submit an evaluation form. The learning outcomes for today's session are listed here. Before I hand it over to our moderator for today's session, I would like to draw your attention to the resources and references presented on this slide and the subsequent one. These materials contain essential information and resources that will enhance your foundational understanding of this topic. If you are attending this webinar live, copies of the slides will be distributed with the evaluation in a follow-up email. If you are viewing this presentation on the NASN Learning Center, please locate the slide deck under the Resource tab. The National Association of School Nurses is collaborating today with Brady United and End Family Fire to conduct this webinar. Gun violence continues to be the #1 killer of children in America. In June of 2024, former U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy issued a landmark advisory declaring firearm violence in America to be a public health crisis. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our moderator for today's panel discussion, Kalita Armstrong.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen. I know all of that information is super important to make sure that we are in alignment with what NASA needs to make sure that you all get the credits that you are looking for from this. So happy to have her have that done for us and excited to get started. I first want to make sure that as we have already kind of been grounded, that we're talking about how gun violence in America really is a mainstay in everyday life for us, and how each one of us in some way has either been personally affected by it, we know someone who's been affected by it, we have seen things happening in the media, and in general, right, each of us has a role to play in making sure that we can end gun violence in America. And so we're excited today to kind of bridge the gap between school nurses, the school community, and the work that End Family Fire does with Brady United. And so before we get into all of that, obviously, I want to start by making sure everyone who is on our panel today can introduce themselves. So I want to start with Robin Cogan, who kind of helped us begin this partnership. So I'll start with you, have you introduce yourself, and then we'll have Karen Graff introduce herself, and then we'll have Karen Slovack.
Well, first of all, I'm so honored to be here, to be on this amazing panel, and I appreciate the relationship, the collaboration between End Family Fire and the National Association of School Nurses. This is such an important topic, and I can't wait to get started. So I'll very, very briefly, I am a school nurse in Camden, New Jersey. I have been a nurse for 40 years and a school nurse for 25. I have a personal and professional reason to be so involved in gun violence prevention. As Karen mentioned, gun violence is the #1 cause of death of children and teens in this country and has been for 3 years. So as school nurses, we are on the front lines of addressing this. And so that's why this webinar is so important and so exciting to collaborate with these great colleagues.
I'm Karen Graff. I'm a registered nurse and former school nurse of 35 years. I grew up and I live here in a frontier and rural state where firearms, hunting, and shooting sporting events are part of our heritage. In fact, my good friend in high school at the age of 18 won a gold medal in women's automatic air rifle, the first time the event was held in the Olympics. Also, my family hunted for food and used that as we were in a lower socioeconomic environment. So this is important to me because the area that I live in, there are 48% of homes in my state have guns. And so therefore, this becomes a concern of mine from a public health standpoint, as school is a place where education needs to be had, and starting with parents and with following up with students on encourage them to have good gun safety storage that's safe and secure. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Karen Slovak, and I'm from Capella University. I work in the doctoral program at Capella, and I completed a dissertation a long time ago, maybe 27 years ago. It feels like ages ago, but my dissertation was on violence exposure in the homeschool and community, and I looked at a rural area as part of my dissertation. And back then it was very surprising. Like, I was a school social worker there, so I knew people had a lot of guns. But the urban researchers were very surprised that there was more firearm access and shootings and exposure to gun violence in the rural areas than in downtown, the urban areas, downtown Cleveland and such. So I started on a journey of researching rural violence, exposure to firearms, but also just what social workers can do. So a lot of my research has been focused on firearm assessment and safety counseling for social workers. How could we train them, educate them? What do we know? What do we don't know? And how can we talk to our families about this in rural areas or other areas as well?
Beautiful. Thank you all for that. And I want to just bring light one more time to what both Karens have said, that what we're hopeful for tonight is that we are really addressing the concerns of both, school nurses in rural areas and in urban areas, right? That nothing that we share tonight is just going to be solely for those in cities. Our hope is that any of the resources, any of the information that we're sharing tonight really works for everyone across the country to be able to bring this information to their communities. And so, quick introduction of myself, since I've kicked it to my awesome panelists first. My name is Kalina Armstrong, and I am the Senior Program Manager on the And Family Fire team. We are a public service advertisement education program with Brady United. The goal with our program is to be apolitical and to really have a call to action of securing your firearms. It's not about taking firearms away. We understand that in this country, firearms are a mainstay. They're going to be a part of our culture for at least the foreseeable future. So how do we make sure that those who own them as securely and responsibly as possible? And so with that, I want to share just a little bit about And Family Fire's background before we get into the questions, since that's kind of going to ground us in the same kind of understanding of what secure storage is and what ending family fire is. So And Family Fire started on August 8th, 2018 to bring awareness to the 8 kids a day that are killed in unintentional shootings in this country. And so we thought like it's so important to be able to bring that 8 kids a day into the conversation every single time we have the conversation, because we know, right, that the little people of our country are not the people that we want to see killed in these kinds of situations, these kinds of instances. And so how do we continue to have a conversation where family and protecting your family is the center of that conversation, but what do we need to do as the adults in the room, if you will, to make sure that we really can protect our children? And so End Family Fire kind of comes into this conversation with the lens of education, right? How do we educate people on the best ways to own their guns, to own them as securely as possible? And then how do we educate those within the community of those who own weapons in order to say, we get it, you've got these, wonderful. How can we have a conversation about what's the best way to keep these and keep them as securely as possible? And so one of the newest, if you will, ways that we are trying to get this information out is in these partnerships, right? And so the National Association of School Nurses is our first partner that we're really honing in on. There are intersections between the work that you all do every single day and the work that we do every day. And so how do we make that how do we tap into that as much as possible? And so I'm hopeful today is the first of many of these kinds of conversations. So what I'd first like to do is share one of our PSAs with you. This PSA is called Prepare for Misuse. It is based in or the story behind this is that a child finds an unsecure weapon in the home, and then it kind of shows the events that ensue after that. And so I want to give a quick trigger warning that both of the PSAs that we're showing today can potentially elicit some feelings. So just want to share that here, that they are tough topics. And when we're talking about gun violence, that's a tough topic anyway. But I'm hopeful that that'll kind of help, again, ground us in the secure storage conversation as we start our panel. So if I could have some assistance, thank you so much.
I know my gun should be stored locked and unloaded. But what good is a gun if it's not prepared for use? So instead, I'm prepared for misuse. I'm prepared to stop arterial bleeding in 3 minutes. Less for kids, they bleed out faster. My son just shot himself. Hurry. Access to firearms triples your risk of death by suicide. But that's not the only way to misuse a gun.
I think I heard Mama.
Misuse can happen when you least expect. So being prepared means knowing the difference between CPR for adults and kids. Unintentional shootings happen every day.
There's been another deadly shooting in a local elementary school.
So that sense of safety my guns bring me
The gun he acquired from the family member's home.
can shatter in an instant.
The developing story will bring you more updates as they happen.
Store your gun securely, locked, unloaded, and away from ammo.
So I first want to ask you all, obviously, would love to get like just initial thoughts around how the like emotions that this PSA has evoked for you, and like what it kind of brings to mind for you as you think we're having this conversation about secure storage, right? And how can this kind of be like a jump off point, right? Like how can this kind of open the door, if you will, for us to start talking about something that can seem very political and difficult to talk about, but something that we do need to be having discussions on. And Robin, I see that you came off mute, so I'm happy to have you start us off.
Yeah, I mean, what a powerful message. The idea here is that guns live among us. There's actually almost 100 million more guns than people. There's about 300 million people in the country and almost 400 million guns. A large number of those guns were actually bought during COVID. Almost 100 million were bought during COVID. And the escalation of gun violence has increased significantly since COVID, including having children be the number one cause of death. I'm sorry, having guns being the number one cause of death of children. I love, there is a wonderful PSA out there called Agree to Agree. And Agree to Agree, I hope we can do a follow-up so we can show that fantastic PSA. Agree to agree is where there is an assembly of parents thinking that they're going to a debate of their adolescent kids. And what it turns into are ways that we can come together. There are shared values in this work. I think it is a shared value to want everyone safe. We want our children safe. We want our family members safe. I think we can agree to that, right? And so the work that makes the most impact is prevention. How do we stop the bullet from leaving the chamber when there are children around? How do we protect our most vulnerable? And so that's where we can agree to agree, because clearly people have the right to own guns. People have the right to hunt. People have the right to raise their families as they see as part of their family culture. But we have a responsibility to keep our children, our community, our school community safe. And that's why these conversations are so impactful.
Yes. I love that, right? The title for tonight is proactive care, right? And you're also talking about preventative care, right? So how can we be both action verb, right? Making sure that we are being not only talking about this is the problem, but being proactive about how do we actually solve this problem? How do we prevent this problem from ever happening, right? How do we get to the root of the issue? I love that. I love that. Karen Graff or Karen Slovak, anything you'd like to add to that?
This is Karen Graff, and I think for me, as I transitioned from the emergency room to school nursing, I thought I wouldn't need to address any firearm misuse, and yet that was one of the reasons for me leaving was I struggled with knowing a small community and then having to care for people who had some misuse, whether it be through suicide or an accident or anything like that. And so emotionally for me, that short little video brought up a lot of emotion as I remembered former patients of mine. Once I got to the school setting, I did see that my responsibility as a school nurse would be in the public health arena to do the prevention work on that. And so for me, part of it was getting the parents to buy in, because I always like to remind parents that every gun that gets into a child's hands first passes through that adult. And so it's our responsibility first. So I met with PTAs and I got the parent buy in first before I did any kind of education within the school. And then also reached out to our public health department for their gun safety and some of their suicide prevention programs to elicit money to have some locks be available to families. And so, one way that I bring up the conversation with families is at Kindergarten Roundup. As the parents are traveling through the different stations, completing all their forms, they come to the school nurse and reviewing their immunizations. I talk about car seats or seatbelt safety, and then also I have gun locks available sitting on my desk, and I do bring it up that we have guns. If you have a gun, can I give you a lock, or do you have it locked up? And they are free of charge, and I'm happy to hand those out at that time. And I feel like that's a safe environment for those families. There's no judgment on my part. I'm not talking about a gun being bad or anything. I'm just talking about safety.
Yeah, and I love that as well because I think oftentimes something that we are trying to do, and what's really been the impetus behind End Family Fire has been like a culture change idea, right? So changing the behavior and the attitudes towards how we secure our firearms. And I love that you're saying like we're talking about seatbelts, right? We're talking about, with children, we're also talking about like allergies, right? All of the ways that we keep our children safe. Here is another way that we want to be able to keep our children safe, right? And putting all of that in one conversation, I feel like that kind of like starts to break down the taboo we have around having these conversations, and it makes it easier to say, this is literally about safety. I'm asking you this because of safety. I'm offering you this gun law because of safety, right? Taking out the it's bad to own guns, taking out guns are bad, taking out all of that. I just want you and your family and your children to be safe. So I love that that's how you kind of have this conversation. I appreciate that. Karen, was there anything else that you wanted to share?
I wanted to share that a long time ago, I wrote an article on messaging strategies that social workers could use with families, and we have the social workers rank messages. And I'll give the article to somebody here who could float it out to our participants in here. But the PSA that you showed reminded me of that article because what rose to the top for these clinicians in messaging strategies to families was talking about the facts. Um, and I was trying to surreptitiously pull it up really quickly while we were talking here, but like when it comes to youth suicide, a gun in the home with an adolescent can be an invitation for trouble. A home with a gun is 5 times more likely to have suicide. So these are all very, there were 6 message strategy statements, and most of them had the facts related to it because I think that's what can speak to the parents that we, as school social workers, that we would be working with is again like it's about safety. Like sometimes they don't know about the risks of having a firearm there, and sometimes we use analogies in social work like, well, if you're on a diet and the ice cream is in the freezer and you walk by it, you're probably more likely to get it and eat it versus if you didn't have it there and it was at the store, then you have to really think about it. I have to get my keys, I have to get in the car, I have to go get money. So a lot of what we try to do is to put like space and time in between the act of engaging with a gun, so the thought process can take hold and stop that action. But I like the message. I think that parents do need to know the direct consequences of having a gun. And I think that they will listen because if we're agreeing and working with parents and families on safety. And I like that. That's what we're saying. We're not saying it's bad or it's wrong, but hey, we're going to have things in our house that might be at risk to your child. And this is one of them. So it's a matter of fact. And just working in rural areas, it's not an uncomfortable conversation to have because so many people have guns and go hunting and stuff.
Yes, I appreciate that. And really appreciate the idea of those in rural areas, right? Also owning guns for hunting, and as Karen was sharing, living on like a frontier, and I'm assuming needing to use that firearm for wild animals as well. So like appreciating that we already are. I think we're all on the same page, and I think a lot of gun owners who are either listening to this webinar or that school nurses will be talking to also have the idea that being a responsible gun owner is important, right? Like, I don't think that there are many who have children who are thinking to themselves, like, I can be irresponsible with this, right? I think it's a lot of us really having the conversation about what exactly does responsibility when owning a firearm mean, right? Because as we saw in the PSA, the firearm owner is thinking to themselves, like, I need this to be readily accessible, which we definitely understand because if we're using this for protection, it makes sense to have it readily accessible. But how do you have it be readily accessible to you as the adult versus being readily accessible to your children, right? And so what that looks like to us, as you could see at the end of the PSA, is that it's locked away, that it's unloaded, and it's away from tiny hands that can get to it. Because as Karen, you shared, the fact is that a lot of children will have interacted with their parents' gun without their parent even knowing. And so how do we bridge this gap, right? Of saying responsible gun ownership, yes, but like this is an irresponsible way to have your firearm, right? And so appreciate everything that you all have said in this. And so I want to like keep going because Karen, you've already kind of shared some things that you've done in your school systems that you've worked in to kind of bring parents into the conversation. So I'm thinking, it sounds like you're kind of comfortable, and so I want to know, in having these conversations, what are some things that kind of made it difficult to have them, right? Like, was it about you being a trusted messenger? Was it about the message, as Karen S has shared, right? Like, is it, needing it to be based in facts, not just feelings? Like, kind of talk to us a bit more about like how you got comfortable having the conversation. And then if you've got like a good story where you were able to really share with a parent, we'd love to kind of hear a bit about that too.
Yeah, I think when I started with meeting with a couple of PTAs, I looked at what were those barriers to, parents having that secure storage practice. And so many of it was lack of knowledge. Some of it was financial. Um, but interestingly enough, I think there was a perceived lack of need as shown in the video or the message that was shown. Also, parents, again, like you said, seeing that safe storage may be a nuisance, they can't have it readily available. But in an area where I live, also those society and cultural norms, and how do we change those? And again, it's more talking about that your your safety of your children. The other thing that I noted is there appeared to be an overestimation of the child's responsibility. Well, we've talked to them about it. We've told them not to do this. And I think that's where the disconnect and the red flag went up for me, is that yes, you can educate your children, but also children are going to be curious. Also, middle schoolers and high schoolers may be influenced by social media or other things. And like the other Karen said about the diet and having access to that ice cream, having access to that gun can have some terrible outcomes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And so with that, I'd love to bring Robin back into the conversation. And I'd love for you to share, obviously a bit of, how you reacted to what Karen just shared, because I saw you come off mute. But then also would appreciate you sharing a bit around like, when these instances happen, right? And it's not always that it's a school shooting, right? Sometimes it is an unintentional shooting, a child finding the gun in the home and shooting themselves. Sometimes it's just something that happens in the school community nearby. What are some resources that in your professional career have worked again to kind of bring parents into the conversation, to make it a comfortable conversation, and to again place safety as the heart of the conversation, not gun control, any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. I also think this is an evolution of moving from how we look at guns through a law enforcement lens versus a public health lens. And so the public health lens is one that is very, very natural for school nurses to embrace. It's having the conversations and having the school nurses believe, number one, that they can have these conversations, and number two, understanding where they stand. What is their perspective on this? And then giving them time and space to really hone their conversation. So I've done quite a few things. Karen, I'm thrilled to hear that you gave out gun locks. I applaud you. I do the same thing. I look at this from a harm reduction model. It doesn't hurt to ask, but it kills not to ask, right? So when we talk to families, and this is not just from the school health office, this is from anybody who works with children, all healthcare professionals who work with children. When we think about instructing, encouraging families when, let's say, their children have a play date, what do we focus on? Allergies. Are there aggressive animals in the house? I mean, these are common questions that families are asking. And guess what? Now it is becoming more and more common for a family to say in a very non-accusatory way, by any chance, is there a gun in the house? And just let me ask you how it's stored. And that, if we can normalize those conversations, I think when people hear the statistics and then link stories to those statistics, there's this, I believe, a sea change, a shift. We are all about protecting our most vulnerable. And there's certain drivers of firearm injury that I think many people aren't aware of. I just want to pull out that in a typical year, now remember, gun violence has increased steadily. It went down last year, thankfully. It's still one of the highest years on record, though. But among all of those gun deaths, let's say there are 45,000, do you know that more than 60% are suicide? And that's because there are many unsecured and loaded guns in our environment. And we know with suicide, when there is a time factor, it's a very snap decision, right? But if like the ice cream, it was not in the freezer, if it was not readily available and enough time passed, we may have saved a life there. So the big issue here is that there are an enormous amount of public health opportunities to research, to test these findings, to hone these findings. And then just like in the nursing process, let's look at it all over again. How can we impact those social norms that we're talking about? I shared earlier that there are more guns than people by almost 100 million. And you know what? Only 40% of firearms are stored safely. So of those 400 million, that's not a lot that are stored safely. 2/3 of gun owners across the country have not received formal gun safety training. So when you go back to safety, 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 how do we not come together, as a people? Almost 4.6 million children live with unlocked and loaded guns in the home, and 1 out of 3 homes with kids have guns. And many unintentional shootings, they used to call them accidental, but it's really not an accident when the gun is not stored safely. So the unintentional shooting deaths of children under 17, 45% occurred outside of their own homes. So what's that saying? Happening at friends' houses. Kids are bringing guns to school. 70% of school shooters get their guns from home. And so knowing those statistics that are based in research and looking at ways to mitigate those damages, to stop the bullet before it leaves the chamber, will not impact people's rights to have a gun or to protect their family, but it will save lives. And that whole idea of 8 children a day dying by gun violence and so many more injured, permanently injured. When you hear that, you and you still have a heart, right? You want to be part of the solution.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for sharing those statistics as well, because again, back to what Karen has said, if we can base this whole conversation in the facts, not the feelings, it makes it easier, right, to really get to the heart of safety is what we want here. So I appreciate that. Karen, Slovak, I want to bring you back into the conversation because something that's ruminating for me as both Karen G and Robin are talking is like, what are the resources, right? Like, we're talking about safety and we're talking about, being able to give free gun lots. We're talking about having conversations, right? We're talking about making this more normalized, right? This is just a part of conversation in our country because guns are now a part of, our society. So what are some specific resources that maybe have come to mind for you as you're listening to us talk, as you're thinking about, being in a school setting? What are some resources that kind of come to mind for you as you're like, this would be great for each parent to have access to, right? Or this would be great regardless of if they own a gun or not, right? As Robin is saying, we're just having the conversation because if my kid's coming over to play, I want to make sure that they're safe and so are your children. So talk to us a little bit about some resources.
Sure. So I think a primary important resource is just education. Many families just don't know what can happen when there is a gun in the home. So a story that I can share with you is when I first started this work, I was on a suicide prevention coalition, and one of the members and I went to the American Association of Suicidology conference, and we listened to the Means Matters. Matt Miller, he was speaking just all these facts and talking. I didn't know this woman that well, but we got to talking, and she said that she had lost her son by suicide by firearm. And she said, why didn't anybody tell me this? Like if they would have just told me, my son was depressed, if they would have just told me to not have a gun in the home, you know, that could have saved his life. So I think that we can't be afraid to talk about it, first of all, and educate parents on it. So anything we can do to get the education to families. Unfortunately, it's probably hard to do as a prevention method. It's a lot of times it's when families are in crisis. That's when we're talking to them about these things. If there's any way we could do prevention oriented ideas with the families, like what Karen is doing with giving out the locks, is a prevention measure. So if there's any meetings with families, the parents, that we could talk to them and educate them, like just give them a pamphlet on facts about firearms in the home and then some safety resources, how to securely store. And if sometimes people don't want to store the guns in their home if they have a depressed or suicidal individual, so where can they take those to go get that storage? So I do think education is key. And also for us, feeling comfortable talking to parents about it, and families and communities, there is a free training. It's called Counseling on Access to Lethal Means. And it will help us know the facts and figures to then feel comfortable to talk to families about this in a way where we're walking alongside them and not judging, in terms of these are the facts about guns. I just want you to know this, and this is why your child's at risk if they're depressed or suicidal. So I think educating the parents and families on that is key. Free gun locks are amazing, or just resources of where they could take their guns to safely store them.
Love it. Thank you. Yes. And to that point, we are definitely sharing our In Family Fire one pager, which does have obviously facts about gun violence in America, but also to Karen's point about where to take a firearm if you want to get it out of the house, but still keep it. There's information on that. There is information about talking to children about the having a gun in the home as well. So saying that the education piece, I think, is obviously one of the biggest parts of this, because when you know better, you do better. And so that's our hope with all of this. So thank you. So to bring it kind of back a little bit, Robin shared that, in the wake of the pandemic, there was a increase in those who were purchasing firearms. And what the data shows is that those who were purchasing these firearms were of new demographics, so new racial demographics, new geographic demographics, and we also saw a rise in women in particular starting to own guns. And so one of the things that In Family Fire did with the release of this new data was to create a PSA that was specifically focusing on these new demographic groups, right? Because these were people who hadn't owned guns before, right? So the data is showing that these are people who are now buying a gun for the first time, and they are new. When we say new, we mean new, not just a new gun, but they had not previously owned one. And then some of the data even shows that their families didn't previously own one as well. And so we were thinking, how do we really message to these new parents, these new gun owners, and particularly thinking about parents in this. And so I'd like to share that PSA and then kind of continue this conversation about, again, directly speaking to parents about how to keep themselves and their families safe.
I'm a different kind of threat. I can't be scared away or negotiated with. You can't call the cops on me.
Do you still want to hang out after?
I don't want your money or your TV. I don't even have to break in. I'm invited.
Beautiful, thank you. And so, again, as I just shared, new demographic of people who are now owning guns, and what we've already kind of been talking about, right? Parents not understanding that even though they've had the conversation with their children, we're giving them a bit more responsibility to not be the curious children that they are and to be looking for things that they're not supposed to be looking for, instead of taking the steps that are necessary to be as securely owning these firearms as possible. So Karen, Karen S, I want to start with you, because one of the things that we thought about a lot when we created this PSA is like the cultural awareness of the moment, right? Like understanding why people were purchasing firearms, during and after the pandemic, right? There was just so much uncertainty. There was racial unrest, right? Like there was just a lot happening, and people felt like they were unsafe. And so, bringing in the social work background that you have, I'd love if you could talk to us a little bit more about like how cultural awareness, cultural humility, cultural competence kind of plays a role in being able to have these discussions with firearm owners, with parents who are firearm owners, and how can we be more prepared to have these conversations with these diverse perspectives, these diverse backgrounds, but again, people who are thinking about how do I keep my family safe, and us kind of having this conversation around safety both inside and outside of the home.
Sure. What this brings to my mind is Maslow's hierarchy of need, and we all want that sense of safety and security. Um, and people feel like guns will make them safer, when in fact they probably don't know that they're increasing their risk of being hurt by that gun or hurting somebody else with that gun, etc. So I think that starting like in social work, we say start where the client is. So let's start where they are. What do they bring to the table in terms of their culture, their coping mechanisms, their external supports? Not everyone is coming to the table with the same set of skills and experiences. And in social work, we approach it from trauma informed care. The principles, we want a person to feel safe and secure, and then talk to them about the difficult discussions and walk alongside them. And from a cultural humility standpoint, the client is the expert in their own life. So listening is a huge skill. Just where are they coming from, and why did they get the gun, and what is the gun going to do for them? And they can have a gun if they want one. However, let's talk about what that is adding to your safety and why it might make you more at risk, just in conversation with them. I think that with trauma informed care, people will have different experiences and buy the firearms for different reasons. So we do need to take that into account, just the intersectionality of everything that a client and families will bring to the table and their past experiences, and history of gun violence, history of suicide. So I think that, to go back to the point, is like talking about safety and security first. Why do they feel unsafe? So what is that about? And then talking about the emotional response and their coping and external supports, and just getting help. Um, just having somebody listen and starting where the client is, I think is very important. Listening to their voice. They're the expert.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate they're the expert of their story portion of this, right? Because I think, if we can start the conversation there, then this kind of takes the judgment out of the conversation, right? It's like, got it. I hear why you own weapons. I understand that this is a family thing. I understand you hunt, right? I understand that this is a part of your lived experience and that is important to you. And so I'm just asking about how can that be a part of your lived experience and safety be at the center of you owning this. So I really appreciate that, Karen, because I think that sometimes that's missing in the conversation, because a lot of times, right, we talk about gun safety and people shut down immediately because I think they just hear gun control. But if we can lead with the safety aspect, I think that's how we can really open people's ears. So I appreciate that. Bringing Robin and other Karen back into the conversation, I was really thinking as both Karen S was sharing and as the PSA was playing, that we were talking a lot about like what parents maybe think they know but don't, because they're just not in the room at all times, kind of thing. So thinking about this new group of gun owners, right? The majority of them being millennials, the Gen X and Gen Z, who I'm also assuming are the current parents of children as well. What are some things that you feel like, should be in your toolkit when it comes to talking to them, right? I'm thinking about all the school nurses that are on the call across the country. What are some things that need to be in their toolkits as they're having this particular conversation with this particular new group of parents, right? Like, not just thinking about all parents who own guns, but again, these parents who like just had to, put their kids in front of a computer, right, for a whole year instead of being able to send them into a school, right? Like, what are some things that these new parents are having to deal with that we think also should really help inform how we have this conversation with them?
I can go if and then Karen. So, that is a very layered question,
Yes.
and
Yes.
I appreciate it. I really appreciate it. Listen, we face a lot of barriers having these conversations, right? And the point is to break down those barriers. And in my mind, I'm sure Karen feels the same way. Who better but school nurses? And so this is kind of a shift in how communities gather around the collective action to look at what safety means. Physical safety and psychological safety are very different things, and they have both been incredibly challenged for a long time, especially in the last 5 years. Really, really challenged. We had this invisible virus, and at the same time, we've had an increase in, in incidences of gun violence, and they're both, that whole safety factor has really rocked our foundation. And so when, we encounter these kinds of barriers when we address firearm safety in schools, it's a very sensitive topic. And that's why it's important to come at it from not just apolitical, but from a place of agreeing to agree. It's like that Venn diagram. Where do we have absolute concurrence agreement? And what I've seen is everyone wants the same thing. They want to keep their kids safe. They want their kids to be in an environment at school, whether it's walking to school, walking home from school, being on the bus, coming back from the bus, walking in hallways. They want their kids to be safe. We want everyone to come home every day after school. And as we talked about today, this is not only an incident that happens in school, obviously, but I do want to raise a really often lost data point. And that is, since Columbine, almost 400,000 children have experienced gun violence in their own schools. That's an unbelievable amount of kids. And that is a trauma that follows kids really through their lifetime. And there have been kids who were in a high school, I believe it was many times this happened now, in Ohio. I don't want to get the state right. And then when they went to college, there was an incident at their college. So this pattern is something that we must end. And so we, just for that, to that end, we should be doing everything possible in conversation with families, with children, with staff. We have to have this collaborative approach of reframing how we talk about gun violence prevention. If we reframe it to talk about secure storage, it changes I think it lowers some of the barriers. And one of the things that I have been involved in, and I'm so proud of it, is I was part of a very small study that was teaching school nurses how to have these conversations. It was a small pilot study through Mass General Hospital where we had a didactic piece and there was a practice piece. So school nurses got to have different scenarios and practice these conversations because, we don't We want to feel comfortable using these words. It reminds me of years ago when we were learning about suicide prevention, and there was this false narrative that if you say the word suicide, it will make people want to take action. We know now that that's not true. And it's the same thing with safe storage. When we have a conversation that links other safety issues, smoke detectors, we could go through all the things that public health has done for this country: speed limits, seat belts, summer safety. Safety is a huge thing. And so when we take these conversations from that angle, that is super positive. One of the things that encouraged me the most, sadly, towards the end of the last administration, was that the Department of Education gave a very clear mandate to every superintendent and every school across this country that we as a collective should be teaching safe storage to our families, to our kids, depending on their age, that we had a moral obligation, because kids spend so much time in school, to provide that education. That's been pulled back, unfortunately, but we're going to get through this. We can push forward anyway. Many schools started doing resolutions about safe storage. I mean, it started to become part of typical conversations, and that's what we want to see, right? You get in your car and you put on your seatbelt. I hope that someone comes home from wherever and they take their weapon and they put it one place and they separate it from their ammunition, that it's just like getting in your car and putting on your seatbelt. That's the level of familiarity and comfort that we hope to get to through this awareness campaign.
Yeah, that was a great analogy. I really like that. Yes. Karen G, is there anything you'd like to also add?
No, I just want to just kind of tie Robin's comments back to Karen S. And it's that relationship that you build with the family. And I think that the school nurse is in that pivotal position to be able to build that relationship. And sometimes as students move through the grades, maybe you're connected to that family for 15, 20 years, maybe even more. Now you're maybe seeing the grandkids. Having that relationship, and as Karen S. said, listening to where they're coming from. That's so important, that you don't just jump right in and say, this is what's going to happen, and this is how we do it, and this is how we're going to prevent this. And really listening to where they're coming from and meet them where they're at.
Absolutely. Yes, 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 yes. The idea again of letting them be the author of their own stories, letting them be the center of their own story. And then, as you're saying, Karen G, literally listening to what they say and using that as a way to bridge this gap, to open up the conversation, so that, again, it doesn't feel like an attack, but it feels like, back to what Robin is saying, something that is literally a mainstay, right? When we get into the car, we immediately put on our seatbelts, right? Like that has become second nature. I don't even start my car before my seatbelt is on, right? Like that, and that's what we want, right? When we're talking about culture change, when we're talking about the work that End Family Fire does, where we're talking about behavior and attitude change, this is all within that same realm, right? That if we're going to own our weapons, then we are putting them into a biometric safe, right? Then we are separating the weapon itself from the ammunition, right? Then we are putting it somewhere where little hands cannot get to it, right? That like all of these steps just become second nature to us, that because owning a weapon has become very second nature to culture in America, right? That because we've got more guns in this country now than we have people, then that does mean this has become a mainstay in our culture, right? So how do we get to the point where this is both a mainstay and the safety it becomes a mainstay as well? So I appreciate this a lot. So as we're getting close to the end, because we obviously could talk about this forever and ever, because there's always something else, right, to share in this conversation, to make sure that, again, as we're talking to those who are here joining us tonight, that we're giving you the tools, the resources, the language, the cultural competency, if you will, right, to really be able to have these conversations with anybody within your school community. Again, not just gun owners, because those who are not gun owners are also a part of this conversation as well, right? If again, as we've shared, if they're taking their child to someone's house, then it is important for them to have this conversation with the other parent. So one thing I'm thinking about as we kind of start to get close to closing out is what's one thing from each of you, what's one thing that you're thinking to yourself right now is like an immediate next step that those on this call can take, right? Whether, it can be whatever you're thinking, but I want to really send people away with something kind of tangible. I know we've got some resources that, will be available to everyone that's been in attendance with us, but I'm also thinking, right now as they're getting off of this call, maybe not right now, but within the next week or so, what's a step that people can be taking to either continue this conversation, to start the conversation with parents in their communities? Yeah, what comes to mind for you all?
I can go if that's okay. I think it has to start with where each individual person feels about we really need to know where we stand individually, because when we're sending messaging out there, it should be, we should be sending messages out that we actually believe in, right? And so I think the first step is finding like-minded people, seeing what's out there to support you as a healthcare provider, as an educator, understanding the impact of this important issue, and then finding out, based on your focus, how you can best serve your school community. Just a very quick story, but I have a history of gun violence in my family, multiple generations. Between my father, who lost his entire family when he was 12 years old from a neighborhood shooting, to my niece, who was a Parkland student. So within one couple generations in one family, it impacted all of us. And that generational trauma, believe me, it exists. But that day when my sister was standing outside of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, telling me what was happening, I was giving her updates that I could see. I remember saying to her, I'm going to do everything in my power as a school nurse, as a family member, as an aunt, as a sister, as a daughter, but especially as a school nurse, to look at this from a public health perspective, because we can prevent this. We don't have to live with the acceptance that 8 children a day should be dying from firearm injuries. And so it does sometimes take a direct connection, a passion project, a desire to be part of something much bigger than yourself. And for what better reason than to improve community safety and school safety?
I'll piggyback off what Robin just said, because I was thinking some of the same things, that finding people at your school or in your community and maybe creating a little, I hate to use the word task force because that sounds like really big, but maybe just a work group to figure out what we can do. I don't think it should be the nurse's role or the teacher's role or the social worker's role or the principal's role. I think that an interdisciplinary team to kind of figure out what can we all do to send out the same message and all be on the same page and develop resources so wherever they go, whoever they come in contact with would hear the same message, and we're all supporting each other, because this work is not easy. It's difficult to think about this and people dying by firearms and talking to people about it. So I think an interdisciplinary team of sorts to kind of see what is your landscape of where you're at and where you're working and what can you do. And everybody's landscape is going to be a little different in terms of what could be done and what can't. But I think the conversation has to start not just with one voice, but with many voices kind of coming to the table and figuring out the common ground and how we can work together as a team in this specific community for this problem.
I think I'll let you wrap things up as we're short on time, but they perfectly said what I had in mind as well.
We are literally at time. So I want to thank each and every one of you for being a part of this conversation with us. Again, this is the beginning of having these conversations with school nurses. And again, thank you to Robin for making this partnership possible through her work with Brady and with This Is Our Lane. And then thank you, Karen Slovak, for joining us as well. We really appreciate having the social emotional component to this, because I think as we've really been kind of ruminating around today, is that this is a difficult conversation to have. And so how can we be as socially and emotionally prepared to have these conversations as possible? And then Karen Graff, thank you so much for, again, bringing that role perspective for us, because again, I think we think a lot about gun violence in the vein of cities, but we really want to be thinking about this across the country, because everyone in some way is affected by this or knows someone who is affected by this. So I appreciate everyone who joined tonight. Again, hopeful that the resources that we have shared both here live have been helpful, but also the ones that you will get after the fact will be helpful as well, because we know how difficult the work can be, and we're hopeful that what we've provided tonight will help you begin this work. And so I'll pass it back to Karen G so that she can share a final few words from NASN.
Sure. So on behalf of NASN, again, thank you so much for attending this webinar, and an extra special thanks to Brady United and End Family Fire for partnering with NASN on this important topic. A quick reminder for those of you who wish to have contact hours, please complete the evaluation form. And this webinar has been recorded today and will be archived in the NASN Learning Center. Thank you and good night, everyone.